Welcome, Prof Ellis, to the website tcelacademic.org. Rod is with us here in Preston, and we've had a day's events talking about and looking at task-based language teaching and learning, and he's going to talk to us about task-based pedagogy, the what, the why and the how. So I wonder if we could begin with the what side, please. I wonder if you could just give us a working definition of what you understand by task-based pedagogy.
Well, central to task-based language pedagogy is the notion of task. So in order to talk about task-based language pedagogy, one has to have a clear understanding of what one means by a task. And I've tended to define task in terms of four key criteria. That is to say, it's a language teaching activity where there is a primary focus on meaning, in the sense that the task requires learners to create communicative messages and understand communicative messages. The second criterion is that there's some kind of gap, and typically the gap is either an information gap where one person has information that another person doesn't have, or an opinion gap where people have the same shared information but they use that information to try to agree on a particular opinion or a particular solution to a problem. The third criterion, which I increasingly feel is perhaps the most central one, is that in task-based language teaching, learners are required to use their own resources, and that includes both linguistic resources, that is to say they have to use whatever knowledge of the language that they have in order to participate in the task, and also it includes non-linguistic resources, gesture, maybe even drawing a picture, body, posture, etc. And it seems to me that it is perhaps that particular criterion that distinguishes task-based language teaching from more traditional approaches to language teaching, because in more traditional approaches to language teaching, the learners are given the language that they will need in order to do the task, and typically they are only required to manipulate that language. They're not required to create messages using their own linguistic resources. And the fourth criterion, also very important, is that there must be some kind of communicative outcome other than simply the use of language for its own sake. That is to say, in a task, language is used in order to achieve a communicative outcome. And the communicative outcome might be what kind of punishment a group of criminals should be given. It might be listening to someone and being able to draw in a route on a map, so the route on the map is the communicative outcome. In the other example I gave about the prisoners, the actual punishment that you're going to assign to the individual prisoners is the communicative outcome. So four criteria: focus on meaning, some kind of gap, use your own linguistic and non-linguistic sources, and there has to be a communicative outcome, not simply the display of language.
Thanks for that. Very clear, very concise. I wonder if we could move on to look at the rationale for task-based approaches, what we know about learning and that suggests that adopting a task-based approach is advantageous.
The rationale for task-based language teaching actually draws on a number of different theoretical positions. It draws on an assumption that the goal of language teaching should be to develop that type of knowledge, that procedural knowledge that will enable learners to participate easily, naturally in communication. And the kind of knowledge that is required for that is really implicit knowledge of language rather than explicit knowledge of language. So task-based language teaching serves as a means for helping learners to develop implicit knowledge. And the underlying idea is that the use of tasks in the classroom enables the teachers to create the conditions for language learning and for communicating that exist outside the classroom. And that in order to learn how to communicate outside the classroom, one needs to replicate those same conditions inside the classroom. Traditional language teaching, much of it engages the learner in careful, controlled production, develops perhaps explicit knowledge rather than implicit knowledge, and thus there is often a problem of transfer of what they're able to do in the classroom to what they are able to do when they are communicating in the real world, face to face with people. So that is one of the principal rationales for task-based language teaching. A second rationale for task-based language teaching is the recognition that task-based language teaching caters to incidental language acquisition. That is to say, the acquisition that takes place without any deliberate intention on the part of the learner. And it's argued that in general, most of the learning that takes place when one learns a language is incidental rather than intentional. There are limits to how much one can learn of a language intentionally. There are limits to whether one can intentionally master the pronunciation of the deliberate sounds that make up the language. There are limits to the number of words that one can learn intentionally. There are limits to the extent to which one can learn the complete grammar of a language intentionally. And therefore, much of the learning that takes place has to be incidental. And task-based language teaching does, of course, cater to incidental language learning.
Thank you for that. I'd like to move on to look at the how of task-based teaching. You've already touched on that, but more specifically, the kinds of procedures that we would expect to see in a typical class-based task-based classroom compared to a more traditional PPP classroom, for example.
I think perhaps before I embark on trying to answer that question, I would like to clarify one or two misconceptions that exist about task-based language teaching. One misconception is that task-based language teaching involves putting learners into pairs or groups in order to perform speaking tasks. And certainly that is part of task-based language teaching, but it is not task-based language teaching in its entirety. Task-based language teaching can also involve input tasks, input-based tasks. That is to say, tasks that require learners to listen to input and to process the input in order to achieve some type of outcome. And I would like to emphasize that task-based language teaching needs to be viewed as an approach for developing all four language skills, not just speaking skill. I'd also like to emphasize that task-based language teaching does not necessarily involve putting learners into groups. It also involves teacher-class participatory structures, where a teacher is doing a task with all the students. Having established that, I can go back to your question, which is, what is the how of task-based language teaching? perhaps what is essential to task-based language teaching is that while students are being engaged in accomplishing a communicative task, their attention is also being attracted to linguistic form. And this brings in what Michael Long has called focus on form. That is to say, communicative tasks are not just a device for increasing fluency or for helping learners to practice what they already know. Tasks also create contexts in which learners can learn new language. And they learn new language by having their attention drawn to particular linguistic forms while they are doing the task, while they are primarily focused on meaning. So when we say in task-based language teaching there is a primary focus on meaning, we do not mean that there is an exclusive focus on meaning. We also envisage that from time to time, while students are doing their task, they will be attending to specific linguistic forms that they need in order to do the task. And this is equally true of input-based tasks or output-based tasks. Input-based tasks can be devised that will cause learners to pay attention and to process particular grammatical structures. Output-based tasks provide an opportunity for corrective feedback. That is to say, learners may make an attempt to say something, the meaning may be clear, but an opportunity arises for the teacher to provide a quick correction without disturbing the overall communicative flow of the task. So focus on form is an essential element of task-based language teaching and is crucial to the how of task-based language teaching.
Thanks very much for that. I'd like to conclude by reflecting a little bit on some of the challenges, or in your talk you talked about caveats with task-based approaches. And in particular, a question that I find my MA students ask me all the time, and that is, it's all very well for you. I have to work with a large class and a structural syllabus. Task-based approaches are not applicable in this kind of context. I'm sure you've heard it. I'm sure many of us have heard that. What kind of response would you give to a statement like that?
Well, first of all, let me take the large class. It's perfectly possible to do task-based language teaching in large classes. I've used tasks with very large classes, 60, 70 students in them. It's probably easier to do input-based tasks with a large class, because in an input-based task, the input is coming from the teacher, and the students need to process the input in order to achieve the outcome of the task. So if it was a map drawing task, the students may have copies of a map, and the teacher at the front may be giving instructions, directions about the route that they need to write in on the map, etc. So it is possible to do task-based language teaching with very large classes. Probably easier with input-based tasks, but also possible with production tasks, with output-based tasks, if the teacher is a good classroom manager and can very rapidly put students into pairs or groups and very rapidly give clear instructions about what they want to, about what the students need to do. Of course, in a large class, it's very difficult for teachers to monitor what students are doing. And perhaps in a large class, for that reason, task-based language teaching might be better implemented through input-based tasks. Input-based tasks, it's also possible actually, even in a whole class context, in a teacher-class participatory structure, it's quite possible for the teacher, to do information gap tasks. The essence of an information gap task is that one person or set of persons has one set of information, another person has the other information, and this information needs to be shared in order to accomplish the task. And with a large class, it's perfectly possible that all the students have one set of information together, and the teacher has the other information, and the students, in order to do the task, need to elicit the information from the teacher, and the teacher needs to elicit information from the students. The advantage of doing that kind of production task in a whole class environment is again focus on form, because one of the main ways in which focus on form occurs is definitely reactively through corrective feedback. And putting students in pairs, we don't know to what extent students will be engaging in mutual corrective feedback, but if the teacher is doing the task with the whole class, the teacher has the opportunity to recast, to request clarification, to use all the strategies associated with corrective feedback, etc. The other problem is the structural syllabus. The answer that probably a proponent of task-based language teaching would give to that problem is get rid of the structural syllabus, right? And replace it with a task-based syllabus. Yeah. But you're perfectly right that in many contexts it's not possible to do that. But it is still possible to teach a structural syllabus using a task-based approach. And this does not need resorting to task-supported language teaching, which in my opinion is just a version of BPP, present, practice, produce, where the task comes in the final phase. I think it's still possible to teach a structural syllabus through task-based language teaching. It involves the development of focused tasks. So I need to make a quick distinction between focused tasks and unfocused tasks. Unfocused tasks are tasks that are designed to elicit general samples of language use. That is to say, they have not been designed in such a way that they make it useful or perhaps even essential for learners to process or use a particular grammatical structure. A focused task, on the other hand, is a task that has been designed to create a communicative context for the use of a predetermined grammatical structure. But it's still a task, because the primary focus is on meaning, there's an information gap, the learners are going to use their own linguistic resources, you're not going to give them the structure they're supposed to use, it has to come from them, and there is some type of communicative outcome, right? So potentially you can teach a structural syllabus by means of focused tasks. Focus on form becomes quite crucial again. And again, I tend to feel that it would be better to implement the tasks through teacher-class interaction, through a teacher-class participatory structure, so that the teacher has the opportunity to feed in uses of the target structure of the day, etc. Because it's quite likely that when students are performing a focused task, they might still avoid the use of the actual target structure. Learners, students are adept at avoiding using something that they find difficult to use. And this is where the focus on form is crucial, because the teacher can feed in examples of the target structure quite naturally as part of the process of communicating while they're doing the task, through recasts, for example, and providing opportunities for students to uptake a recast when a recast is given. So it is possible. I really would like to conclude by making clear that I am not positioning myself as someone who sees task-based language teaching as a total alternative to more traditional approaches such as PPP. I've always felt that there is a case for PPP. What I probably do not think is that you can successfully develop the interactional competence, the communicative ability, if you are relying on PPP entirely. But clearly there is a case sometimes for engaging learners in intentional learning, because PPP caters to intentional learning. TBLT caters to incidental learning. Much of learning is incidental. But some grammatical features are probably only going to be learnt intentionally. Things like third person S, the article system, for example, and a number of other grammatical features, which are probably not going to be picked up incidentally. And intentional language learning is probably needed. So I've always felt that really we shouldn't see TBLT as a sort of bandwagon that we all need to clamber on and abandon PPP. What we need to do is look at our particular situation, look at the context in which we are working, and decide what kind of balance we need between TBLT lessons and more traditional type lessons, etc. And perhaps in this respect I differ from other proponents of TBLT who do seem to see TBLT as a replacement for PPP. I see it as offering learners a very different learning experience in the classroom, which is very important, because the kinds of interaction that arise from performing a task are very different from the types of classroom interaction that you get in a PPP lesson. And those types of interaction that occur in a TBLT lesson are needed to provide learners with the experience of using language, learning language that matches more closely with what they'll have to do in real life. So there is definitely a place for TBLT in any curriculum, but not always and not necessarily as a complete replacement for more traditional PPP approaches.
Professor Rod Ellis, on behalf of TESOLacademic.org, thank you very much for your contribution.